The peace that keeps you powerless. She smiles politely, nods, swallows her frustration, like she's been taught. Her voice is calm, agreeable, but inside, something clenches a truth, unsaid, a need unmet, a boundary crossed, she tells herself. It's not worth the argument, and just like that, another part of her dies. This is how it begins, not with a scream, but with a silence. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in fragments, each time you avoid conflict to keep the peace, not world peace, not philosophical peace, but social peace, the kind that keeps things comfortable, predictable, tidy. You learn early that saying what you really think is dangerous. That disagreement causes tension. That tension risks rejection, and rejection feels like death, so you adapt. You avoid the argument with your boss, even when you're clearly exploited. You don't tell your partner what really bothers you because you don't want to seem dramatic. You nod during conversations with friends who say things you don't agree with because you fear becoming that person. You become a master of suppression, a performer of harmony, and they praise you for it. They say you're mature, easygoing, emotionally intelligent. They applaud your flexibility, your politeness, your chill. But what they're really applauding is your submission. Because make no mistake, your silence is not always maturity. Sometimes it's fear in disguise. You call it emotional control. They call it professionalism. Society calls it virtue. Nietzsche called it slavery. Friedrich Nietzsche saw it for what it really was. A moral system designed not to elevate the human spirit, but to castrate it. A morality that teaches you not to rise above others, but to shrink below them. A system that punishes the strong for being strong and rewards the weak for calling their weakness virtue. He called it slave morality, and its most seductive lie, that avoiding conflict makes you a good person. But what if avoiding conflict doesn't make you good? What if it just makes you invisible? We've been trained to equate peace with virtue, but we rarely ask, what kind of peace? There's the peace of self-respect and the peace of submission. There's the peace that comes from solving problems, and the peace that comes from ignoring them. They look the same on the outside, but one builds your soul. The other erodes it. The person who avoids conflict for too long doesn't become happier. They become numb. They lose their spark, their voice, their edge. They become someone who wakes up at 35 or 55 and can't recognize themselves, who wonders when their life became so safe and so meaningless, because the avoidance of conflict doesn't eliminate pain. It just delays it, stores it, lets it grow in the shadows, and eventually it explodes, or worse, it never explodes. It just hardens into resentment, regret, a quiet ache for the life that might have been lived if only you had spoken up. This is what Nietzsche was warning us about. He didn't write for comfort. He wrote to provoke, to shatter illusions. And the illusion he hated most was the one that told people they were moral because they were afraid to fight too. Nietzsche. This was not morality, it was weakness dressed up as goodness. He believed that modern morality had been hijacked, that it no longer served the flourishing of the human spirit, but the safety of the herd. In his eyes, the ideal human wasn't obedient, polite, or conflict-averse. The ideal human was defiant, independent, willing to confront, willing to be disliked, willing to disturb the false peace that society worships, because that peace, when bought at the price of truth, is not peace at all. It's a cage, and most people have learned to decorate their cage so beautifully. They forget they're still inside it. Let's go back. Imagine a child, curious and expressive. They ask too many questions. They interrupt. They cry when something feels unfair. They demand explanation. What do we call that child? Difficult, disruptive. Too much, so we train them subtly, systematically. We teach them to lower their hand, to use their inside voice, to wait their turn, to not interrupt, to say sorry when they haven't done anything wrong. We call it socialization. What it often is spiritual domestication. We condition people to be agreeable, because agreeable people are easier to manage, and then we confuse their agreeableness with goodness. But compliance is not character, and niceness is not virtue. Niceness is often just fear that's been polished, fear of judgment, Fear of rejection, fear of confrontation, fear of being seen as anything other than nice. But what has niceness cost you? How many hard conversations have you avoided because you didn't want to upset someone? How many boundaries have you let crumble because you didn't want to seem cold? How many times have you betrayed yourself in the name of harmony? This is the peace that keeps you powerless, the kind of peace that makes you quiet when you should roar, that makes you agreeable when you should resist, that makes you nod when your soul is screaming. This is wrong. Nietzsche once wrote, "You must be willing to burn in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you have not first become ashes?" What he meant was this: true growth is violent, not toward others, but toward the false self. The self that conforms to survive. The self that avoids conflict to avoid abandonment, to become free. You must be willing to fight not with fists, but with truth. You must be willing to risk offense, to disturb the comfort of others, to break false peace for the sake of real clarity, because real peace, the kind that frees your soul, only comes on the other side of conflict. It comes after the conversation you were afraid to have, after the truth you thought would make them leave, after the boundary you thought would make you unloved. It comes after the moment you decide that being true is more important than being liked. That's what Nietzsche was trying to tell us, that most people aren't at peace, they're in avoidance, that most people don't grow because they've confused repression for maturity, that most people stay small, silent, and scared because they've been told it's moral. But there's nothing moral about disappearing. The world will tell you that you're difficult when you speak your truth, that you're selfish when you set boundaries, that you're cruel when you say, "No, let them talk," because the real betrayal is not when others misunderstand you, it's when you misunderstand yourself. To make them comfortable, so ask yourself, what have you been avoiding? What truth have you buried in politeness? What part of you have you silenced in order to be loved? And what would it feel like to stop? To tell the truth, to speak the thought, to draw the line, to walk away, not to escape, but to reclaim, because the longer you avoid conflict, the further you drift from freedom, and the further you drift from freedom, the harder it becomes to remember who you really are. But somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the smiles, beneath the nice, agreeable mask, there's still a flame, and that flame, no matter how small, is waiting not for peace, but for fire. Nietzsche's warning: the slave morality trap. In a world where politeness is praised and obedience is mistaken for virtue, it's easy to forget that morality isn't always born from goodness. Sometimes it's born from weakness disguised as righteousness. Friedrich Nietzsche looked at the moral codes of his time and saw not wisdom, but submission, not virtue, but resentment made sacred. He called it slave morality. To understand what Nietzsche meant, we must first ask, who defines what is good, and who benefits from that definition? For Nietzsche, the answer was simple: those who lacked power redefined goodness to serve their condition. They couldn't dominate, so they labeled dominance as evil. They couldn't confront, so they sanctified passivity. They couldn't assert, so they made humility a moral obligation. It wasn't an ethical revolution. It was a psychological strategy. Imagine this: a man lives in chains, he cannot break them. So he tells himself chains are noble, that humility, patience, and suffering are the path to virtue, that those who fight, who hunger for more, who live boldly, are sinners, dangerous, proud. This is not just a man surviving. It's a man moralizing his weakness, and if he can convince enough others, those chains don't just stay on him, they spread. Nietzsche didn't write this to mock the weak. He wrote it to expose how morality had become a prison crafted by the powerless, but used to govern everyone. He contrasted slave morality with what he called master morality, where slave morality values meekness. Master morality values strength, where slave morality rewards obedience. Master morality rewards self-overcoming. Master doesn't ask, "What will they think of me?" He asks, "What must I become?" This is not tyranny, it's existential courage. But slave morality was brilliant in one way. It disguised its origin. It didn't say, "We are weak, So let's make everyone else weak too. It said, we are righteous, the strong are dangerous, the proud are evil, and it worked. Because it appealed to the masses, and because it cloaked fear as morality. Nietzsche saw this shift happen most profoundly in early Christianity. He argued that Christianity, in its rise, reversed the old value system of strength, nobility, and vitality. It lifted the meek above the mighty, and made suffering a spiritual badge. That taught people to love their enemies, turn the other cheek, and deny worldly desires to Nietzsche. This wasn't divine. It was deeply human design, not by God, but by those crushed under the boots of Rome. It was a spiritual revenge against power itself in a world ruled by empires. The powerless needed a new weapon. They found it in morality, in shame and guilt. The strong one said, I can, therefore I may. Now the weak said, you may not, therefore you must not. What emerged was a moral code designed to tame ambition, suppress instinct, and reward quiet submission. Nietzsche called it the transvaluation of values, a complete reversal of what was once considered noble, and he believed this reversal was still shaping the modern world. It shows up in political language that disguises cowardice as diplomacy, in education systems that punish children for assertiveness, but praise them for compliance, in social culture that silences discomfort and makes confrontation taboo. It shows up in people who bite their tongue not because they are wise, but because they are afraid. It shows up in you when you feel anger, but shame yourself for it when you desire something deeply, but call it selfish when you sense a lie in a system. But stay quiet to protect your image. Slave morality runs like software beneath the surface of our society. It tells you that to be good is to be small, to be kind is to be passive, that the noble thing is to endure, not to rise, and it rewards obedience, not strength. Look around. Who thrives in modern systems? The one who speaks the loudest? Not always. Often, it's the one who conforms best, who agrees, adapts, nods even when it betrays their truth. This isn't an accident. It's an ecosystem built on predictability, and conflict threatens predictability. Nietzsche feared that humanity was heading toward herd consciousness, a collective mindset where everyone thinks they're being good, when really, they're just being safe, where individual power isn't expressed, but suppressed, where truth isn't spoken, but filtered, where no one says what they mean, because everyone is trying to survive perception. But here's the terrifying part. When you grow up in this world, you don't see the cage. You call it society, or maturity, or politeness, and if everyone around you wears the same mask, you forget it's a mask. That's how control works, not by force, but by consensus. Nietzsche once asked, how do you know whether you are being used by a moral code, or whether you are using it to grow? The answer is simple. Does your morality make you stronger or smaller? Does it challenge you to rise or tell you to stay still? Does it require you to confront the world or to shrink away from it? Slave morality tells you to avoid conflict, because conflict is evil. Master morality tells you to face it, because growth lives on the other side. This isn't about becoming cruel. It's about becoming honest. It's about recognizing that not all morality is good, that some codes were designed not to liberate you, but to limit you, and perhaps most chilling of all, if society rewards obedience, how do you even recognize your own chains? When punishment feels like discipline, when silence feels like virtue, when weakness feels like wisdom, maybe the most dangerous prison is the one you decorate with ethics, and the most radical act is to stop being afraid of your own power. The psychology of avoidance. Why you fear conflict isn't just uncomfortable. For many, it feels dangerous, personal, shameful, almost like walking into a room where everyone is staring, judging, calculating. Even the smallest confrontation, a difficult email, a raised voice, an unmet need can trigger something primal, the urge to flee, to appease, to disappear. But where does this fear come from? The answer starts deep in our evolutionary wiring. For our ancestors, belonging wasn't optional. It was survival. To be cast out from the tribe meant death. Not metaphorically, literally, you needed others to hunt, to protect, to carry the fire. And so your brain developed a survival reflex. Avoid behaviors that might get you rejected. Avoid conflict. Stay small, blend in that survival. Instinct still lives inside you. It lives in the pit of your stomach when someone raises their voice, in your pulse quickening during disagreements, in your urge to say, it's fine. When it's not, your nervous system still equates confrontation with threat. Not because it is, but because it once was. Add to this the modern rituals of shame as a child. What happened when you said no to an adult? When you argued back? When you cried too loudly or spoke too boldly? You were probably punished or mocked or sent to your room, so you learned to smile when you were angry, to apologize when you weren't sorry, to sacrifice authenticity for approval. This wasn't discipline. It was emotional conditioning by the time you reach adulthood. Conflict avoidance isn't just a behavior, it's an identity. You become the peacemaker, the nice one, the reliable, reasonable person who doesn't cause trouble, and everyone loves you for it. Except you, because inside, something festers. You watch others speak boldly, ask for raises, say what they want, leave what no longer serves them, and you envy their courage. You convince yourself they're just built differently, but they're not. They just haven't surrendered to the same fears you have, or they. Stop letting those fears drive the car. What no one told you is that conflict is not trauma, it's power. It's the act of telling the truth when it would be easier to lie. Not to others, but to yourself. You lie when you say yes to something that drains you. You lie when you accept someone's disrespect without consequence. You lie when you smile while slowly unraveling inside. The lie is not in your words, it's in your silence. And every time you avoid unnecessary confrontation, you're not protecting the relationship. You're abandoning yourself. Think about the last time you said nothing when you should have said everything. The promotion you didn't negotiate for. The boundary you didn't enforce. The love you didn't demand. The apology you gave for simply existing. Now, multiply that by 100. That's how identity erodes, not through catastrophe, but through 1,000 tiny surrenders. Avoidance becomes a way of life, and you start telling yourself stories to justify it. I don't want to make it worse. I'm not good at conflict. It's not worth the fight. They wouldn't listen anyway. But what you're really saying is, I'm afraid, and that fear isn't a flaw. It's a message. It means you're standing at the edge of something important. Conflict is not just friction between people. It's clarity emerging from chaos. It reveals what you value, what you're willing to defend, what you're no longer willing to tolerate. It's the moment you stop editing yourself to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. And yes, conflict can burn, but so can transformation. Every person who has grown into their own power had to cross this threshold. The moment they stopped fearing discomfort more than they feared regret. They stopped fearing being misunderstood more than they feared being invisible. They stopped fearing judgment more than they feared self-betrayal. Real-world examples are everywhere. Employee who watched someone less qualified take the promotion because they stayed quiet. The woman who stayed in a dying relationship because she was afraid of loneliness. The artist who watered down their message to avoid controversy and lost their spark. Student who had ideas but never raised their hand. These are not failures. They're unspoken tragedies. Quiet consequences of a world that teaches us to fear our own voice. And if we're not careful, we pass that fear on. We teach our children not how to speak truth, but how to survive perception. We praise the agreeable child, not the courageous one. We build a culture of chronic politeness, where people would rather implode than risk confrontation. We call this emotional intelligence, but intelligence without courage is just strategy for staying small. Nietzsche would have called this the morality of the herd, a culture that rewards conformity, punishes strength, and labels conflict as dysfunction, when it's often the beginning of real dialogue. The paradox is this: when you avoid conflict to stay safe, you create more danger. You become vulnerable to manipulation. You become bitter, resentful, powerless. and those who don't fear conflict, those who are willing to challenge, to confront, to push begin to shape your life for you, not because they're smarter, but because they're willing to be uncomfortable. This is the turning point. Moment you realize that conflict is not something to fear, it's something to learn, like any skill. It can be refined, like any art. It can be mastered. It begins with understanding the difference between pain and harm. Conflict might hurt, but it rarely harms. Avoidance might feel safe, but it slowly kills. Nervous system was built to keep you alive, but now it must be retrained to help you live. The goal isn't to enjoy conflict, it's to no longer fear it. To trust that your truth can withstand resistance, that you can survive disapproval, that you can speak and still be whole, even if the room goes silent. Because every time you avoid the conversation, the boundary, the break, you don't just keep the peace, you forfeit your freedom. And in a world that feeds on your passivity, that's exactly what it wants. Heracles didn't conquer monsters by tiptoeing around them. He confronted them head on. And history's outsiders, the ones we refuse to remember in polite company, chose the uncomfortable fight. The lonely stand, the painful truth. They chose confrontation over comfort, and in that choice, they found freedom. In that choice, they reshaped the world. Socrates, the stone that shattered Athens. Socrates lived in a society built on outward appearance, wealth, prestige, rhetoric, but he valued something far rarer, truth. He wandered the agora asking questions so cutting, they exposed the hollowness beneath the city's polished veneer. He asked what justice was. He asked what virtue meant. He refused to bow to groupthink. The powerful resented him. Their discomfort grew until it became fear. And fear demanded punishment. He was tried for corrupting youth. Sentenced to death, with poison he faced the cup calmly. He drank it without shame. Why? Because he couldn't accept a life of silence. His final words, an assertion of identity, not surrender. He died free. Socrates' sacrifice wasn't suicide. It was a statement that the maggots of complacency threaten freedom more than any prison. Galileo, conscience over conformity in the 1600s. No one questioned the cosmos. The church had claimed dominion over the sky. Earth was the center of the universe. To think otherwise was to think heresy. But Galileo looked through his telescope and saw truths the church didn't want him to see. He found that Earth moved, that the heavens weren't perfect, that God's creation was more mysterious than doctrine allowed. He was summoned. He faced the Inquisition. They threatened him with torture. They demanded he recant, and he did not. Because he believed their falsehood, but to live, to teach, to breathe. He whispered the words, but he never retracted what he saw. He continued his work in secret. He didn't live the full life he deserved, but he lived as truth compelled him. He refused comfort in the form of blind obedience, and in that refusal, he sowed the seeds of modern science. Malcolm X, radical self-definition in the 1960s. Martin Luther King preached integration, nonviolence, and compromise. He sought peace in the hope it would protect African Americans. It was moral, it was strategic. But for many, it wasn't enough. Malcolm Little became Malcolm X. He rejected the rhetoric of reconciliatory politeness. He refused to stay silent when his people suffered. He called out hypocrisy. He was labeled angry, and embraced that label. He chose confrontation, not surrender. He traveled, he changed, he evolved, but the through line remained. He valued dignity over acceptance. His voice provoked, his enemies multiplied. He was assassinated. Was he a radical? A threat? A rebel? Yes and yes to all, but above all, he was free. He fought for recognition, not permission. These aren't stories of revolutionaries. They are stories of individuals who refused to shrink. They refused to fold into the narratives others had written for them. They chose conflict over comfort, not violence, but truth. Some might say these figures incited unrest, but their conflict wasn't physical, it was existential. They demanded clarity. They called out lies, whether about virtue, science, or identity. They challenged beliefs so entrenched they'd become invisible. They showed us that conflict doesn't have to be a brawl. It can be exposure. It can be a refusal to pretend. It can be asking a question no one dares ask. Alignment with self. What drives someone like Socrates to hemlock? Why risk everything for an idea? Because silence costs more than courage. When you can't speak your truth, you lose your soul. You become someone else, a shadow of yourself, and some people prefer death to that. Galileo could have lived longer. He chose truth over doctrine and lost his freedom. But he didn't lose his mind. He didn't betray the cosmos he had seen. Malcolm X could have had comfort, but he chose self-determination. He chose a life defined on his terms. Cost of comfort. Our ancestors paid with their lives to untangle reality from doctrine, self from approval. What did we pay? Compliments, likes, that we're nice, calm, conflict-free? What if that comfort is a prison with velvet walls? A prison where voices echo but never repeat. A place where your ideas go to die before they're spoken. A prison where yourself is replaced by the polite performative self. Reframing conflict. These stories remind us, conflict is not always chaos. Conflict can be clarity. Conflict can be freedom. They teach us to distinguish the wars worth fighting, the ones that scream for our authenticity, the ones that go unrecognized yet echo across centuries, because comfort without freedom is numbness. Silence without peace is compromise. Obedience without dignity is death, walking toward the edge. You don't have to stand in a courtroom. You don't have to die under poison. You don't have to become famous. But you do need to stand for something. To do. Speak when what you feel is erased. To demand accountability when words are empty. To refuse roles written for you by others. Confidence isn't arrogance. It's refusing to borrow someone else's morality. It's the willingness to stand alone, even when everyone else nods. Your moment of free fall. Maybe this is the moment you pause. Your voice quivers in your throat. Your heart pounds at the idea of disturbance, and fear appears. The fear of being labeled ungrateful. Difficult, radical, but this fear is not always your enemy. Sometimes it's your soul's last cry before being silenced. The only way out is not through silence, it's through the crack you're afraid to break through, the discomfort you're afraid to walk into, the truth you're afraid to say out loud. To someone else, even to yourself. They don't need to applaud you. They don't need to thank you if you're honest. You're already free. If you're aligned with yourself, no one has to recognize your freedom, because it lives inside you. Flame of conflict. Conflicts without consequence are hollow. Conflicts born from cowardice have no meaning. But conflict born from alignment? That is the flame of freedom. These people lived with consequences we can't imagine. But what they walked away with: authenticity, integrity, self-possession, is what the quiet peace of politeness often takes today. When you choose to speak your discomfort, when you step away from a lie that you've been performing, when you decide your soul is worth the label, the friction, the backlash, will you choose confrontation over comfort? The greatest lesson of history's outsiders isn't their fame, their death, their martyrdom. It's their refusal to disappear. Confrontation isn't a curse. It's an act of liberation. Choose to live, choose to stand, choose the flames that shape you rather than the ashes of silence. You don't have to be a martyr, you just have to be alive. The hidden cost of niceness culture. You were told to be nice, not kind, not brave. Nice. Keep your tone light, don't raise your voice, smile, even when you're uncomfortable. Say yes when everything inside you wants to scream no. Apologize often, even when you haven't done anything wrong. Especially then. Nice is the costume we're taught to wear early in life, a performance stitched together with politeness, people-pleasing, and fear, and the world rewards it. Promotions are given to the team player. Teachers praise the well-behaved child. Friends gravitate toward the easygoing one. Romantic partners choose the low-maintenance option, but there is a hidden cost, because niceness, when practiced habitually and unconsciously, doesn't create peace. It creates resentment, burnout, emotional invisibility, a slow erosion of selfhood. You become a mirror for others' comfort and a stranger to your own truth. This is the quiet tragedy of niceness culture. It masks fear as virtue, obedience as maturity, and emotional suppression as strength. It feels like you're winning until one day you realize you've lost something much greater yourself. Modern society elevates niceness like a religion. It's painted as a moral achievement, but let's be precise. Kindness is rooted in courage. Niceness is rooted in fear. There's a difference. Kindness involves boundaries. It can say no. It's honest. Kindness may disappoint someone, but never betrays yourself to do it. Niceness can't afford that. Niceness sacrifices truth for approval. It avoids discomfort at all costs, even the cost of integrity. This is why the nicest people are often the most exhausted, not because they care too much, but because they feel responsible for everyone's emotional stability. They've been trained to manage others' feelings while silencing their own fear. Not calm, they're controlled. Under that control is a nervous system constantly bracing for rejection. Psychologists now understand that chronic niceness is often a trauma response. Specifically, fawning. Fawning is the fourth trauma response after fight, flight, and freeze. It's the compulsion to appease, to become who others want you to be, to avoid conflict by becoming invisible. It's born in homes where love was conditional, where safety meant staying agreeable, where expression came at a cost. So the child learns being good equals being silent, being safe equals being needed, being lovable equals never being a burden. That child becomes an adult who doesn't know how to ask for help, who apologizes for having needs, who says yes when they're drowning in no, who smiles while being dismissed, who nods while being hurt, who says, "It's okay," when it's absolutely not, because deep down, they still believe their worth is conditional. This isn't kindness, it's self-erasure. It's everywhere in relationships, where one partner carries the emotional labor, afraid to be seen as too much. In work environments where good employees don't question poor leadership. In families where speaking truth is seen as betrayal. In schools where silence is the currency of praise. We have created a culture that rewards people for suppressing themselves, and then wonders why so many are depressed, anxious, or burnt out. It's not just personal, it's systemic. Niceness has become a survival strategy, and Nietzsche saw it coming. To Nietzsche, a morality built on submission was not morality at all. It was programming. Slave morality, he argued, elevates traits that keep people manageable: humility, obedience, restraint, not because they're inherently virtuous, but because they benefit the social order. When people are nice, they don't rebel, they don't question, they don't demand, they don't create friction, they fit in. This isn't limited to the powerless in corporate culture. Nice is often weaponized. Whistleblowers are seen as disloyal. Assertiveness is framed as toxicity. Employees are told to be positive, even when they're overworked and underpaid. Translation: don't make us uncomfortable. This is why nice people often get left behind. Their compliance is mistaken for contentment. Their silence is mistaken for strength. Their boundaries are ignored because they don't voice them, and over time, that niceness rots into resentment until one day they snap, or worse, they don't. They just go quiet, cold, or numb. They show up, they smile, but something is missing, a spark that was never allowed to burn. Niceness culture confuses virtue with avoidant behavior, but if we look closer, we find a different motivation behind it. Not love, but fear. Fear of being disliked, fear of making someone angry, fear of being seen as selfish, difficult, or dramatic. This fear drives people to shapeshift, to shrink, to perform. They become masters at managing other people's perceptions, and yet they never feel seen. Because how can anyone truly see you when you've hidden your real self behind layers of niceness? The greatest irony of niceness is this: the more you prioritize being liked, the more invisible you become in a world of emotional performances. Authenticity becomes an act of rebellion, and rebellion doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's simply saying, "No, that doesn't work for me." Sometimes it's letting someone feel disappointed in your boundary and not rushing to soothe their discomfort. Sometimes it's expressing anger, not as destruction, but as information. Sometimes it's choosing to be respected rather than liked, Because people may not always like you when you show up fully, but they'll know where you stand, and more importantly, you'll know where you stand. Nietzsche believed that real freedom comes not from conforming to others' expectations, but from creating your own values, from stepping outside the herd, from saying, "This is who I am," without flinching. That means rejecting niceness as a default. That means choosing authenticity over acceptance. That means understanding that conflict isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's often the birthplace of clarity, because when you stop avoiding conflict, you start discovering who's really safe, who's really listening, and who only liked you when you were convenient. The cost of niceness isn't paid in a single moment. It accumulates like emotional debt. Every unsaid no, every dishonest yes, every smile that masked pain, until one day you wake up and realize you've built a life that doesn't feel like yours. And that's the moment of reckoning, the moment you ask, who am I when I'm not performing? Who am I when I stop managing everyone else's comfort? Who am I when I tell the truth? That's the beginning of real kindness, because kindness without honesty isn't kindness. It's performance, and performance is exhausting, too. Escape niceness culture. You must rewire the belief that your worth is tied to approval. You must learn to sit with discomfort, yours and others. You must allow conflict to exist without rushing to fix it. You must get comfortable with not being understood, with not being praised, with not being easy, because truth is rarely easy, but it's the only thing that keeps your soul intact. Being kind is powerful, being compassionate is rare, but being nice when it means betraying your truth, that is a slow form of self-abandonment. Nietzsche didn't want you to be cruel. He wanted you to be real. He wanted you to look at your conditioning and say, no more, no more smiling through pain, no more shrinking to fit, no more apologizing for your fire. The world has enough polite shadows. What it needs is people brave enough to be seen, unfiltered, unedited, unapologetic. That is the opposite of niceness. That is presence. That is power. That is freedom. Conflict as creative destruction. Most people fear conflict because they mistake it for chaos. They associate it with harm, with instability, with the threat of loss. But Nietzsche saw something else, something deeper. He saw conflict not as destruction for its own sake, but as creative destruction, the necessary breakdown of illusions, masks, and inherited values so that something authentic can finally emerge. Without conflict, there is no clarity, no evolution, no birth of the self. Think of a forest fire on the surface. It looks like devastation. Flames consume everything. The air thickens with ash. Life appears to vanish. But hidden in the soil are seeds that can only germinate through fire. These seeds are heat trigger designed by nature to respond to destruction. That's what Nietzsche meant. Some truths can only be born in crisis in a world obsessed with comfort. We forget that transformation demands friction, not the kind that wounds blindly, but the kind that wakes you up. Conflict is how you confront the lie you've been living and choose something else. Leaving a toxic job, for example, may feel like failure, but it's often the first honest act of self-respect. Ending a dishonest relationship might look like breaking something, but in truth, you're breaking a contract with your own silence. Conflict with others is often the visible mirror of an inner conflict already brewing. The war outside reflects the war within. Nietzsche didn't see this as something to avoid. He saw it as sacred. Wrote, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." Chaos, not as madness but as raw material, the uncomfortable compost from which authenticity grows. In this, Nietzsche wasn't alone. Stoic thinkers like Epictetus argued that adversity doesn't harm us, it reveals us. It shows us where we've placed our values and what we've mistaken for strength. The Stoics believed in turning obstacles into opportunity, not through denial, but by choosing how we respond to discomfort. Eastern philosophy mirrored this insight. Taoism speaks of yielding, not as submission, but as strategic flexibility. The bamboo bends in the storm, not because it is weak, but because it has learned how not to break. Zen koans Invite the mind into confusion to shake it free from illusion. In both systems, challenge is not the enemy, it's the doorway. Modern psychology offers its own parallel in Jungian shadow work. Jung believed we all carry a hidden self, the parts we reject, repress, or deny. Our envy, our rage, our desire, our fear. To become whole, we must confront that shadow, not to destroy it, but to integrate it. That confrontation is conflict, but it's also healing. True growth isn't peaceful. It's not about polishing the surface. It's about excavation, going beneath the polite scripts and uncovering what's raw, real, and repressed. This is why Nietzsche warned against moral comfort zones, systems of thought that pretend to offer peace but actually suppress our becoming. He saw niceness and obedience not as virtues, but as tranquilizers, because if everything is fine, you'll never question what's broken. If everything is peaceful, you'll never disturb the values that are destroying you. This is where creative destruction matters. You tear down not to rebel blindly, but to rebuild with awareness. You challenge a belief not just to disagree, but to test its truth. You endure discomfort, not for pain's sake, but because it's the cost of alignment. Conflict becomes the sculptor of the self. Not every battle is worth fighting, but the ones that challenge your old self. The ones that force you to say, "This is not who I am anymore." Those are sacred. This is how identities are forged, not through applause, but through thresholds. Thresholds of leaving, thresholds of confronting, thresholds of choosing to disappoint others rather than betray yourself. It's why some of the most pivotal moments in life don't feel like victory. They feel like burning, like breaking, like losing something you thought you needed. But once the ash settles, there's something left that wasn't there before. Clarity, direction, fire. You come to realize conflict didn't destroy you. It carved away the parts of you that were never real to begin with. Nietzsche believed that to become who you are, you must pass through fire willingly, not because you're reckless, but because you're honest, because you've stopped pretending that safety is the goal. The goal is freedom, and freedom is never born in silence. Conflict, then, is not the enemy of peace. It is the price of becoming real. Tactical courage. How to engage in strategic conflict. Courage is often misunderstood. We think it's loud, defiant, explosive. But real courage, the kind that actually changes your life, is quiet, calculated, strategic. It's not about winning arguments. It's about reclaiming ground you quietly gave away. It's not about yelling louder. It's about choosing when, where, and how you finally say, "No more." Philosophy means nothing if it stays locked in books. Power begins when you apply it. So the question is, how do you face conflict not emotionally, but strategically? It starts with a shift in mindset. You are not confronting someone to destroy them. You are confronting to stop destroying yourself. When your silence becomes self-betrayal, speaking is no longer optional. It becomes necessity. But speak with precision, not with rage. That's what separates warriors from reactors. The first tool, boundaries without apology. You don't need to justify your limits. A boundary is not a debate. It is a declaration of self-respect. When you say no to a demand that crosses your values, you're not being rude. You're being real. Nice people over-explain. Powerful people don't. A calm, "That doesn't work for me," is stronger than 100 excuses. This doesn't mean you become cold. It means you stop bleeding yourself out to keep others warm. Second, emotional discipline. This is where Stoicism enters. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." In conflict, your greatest enemy is not the other person. It's your impulse to react when they insult you. Stay composed when they lie. Stay focused when they try to bait you. Breathe, delay, respond only when your response serves your outcome. Every second of silence gives you more leverage. Modern neuroscience agrees the prefrontal cortex, the brain's logic center, activates when you pause, but when you react emotionally, the amygdala takes over. You go into fight or flight. You say things you can't take back. You give your power away. Discipline is not suppression. It's selection. You don't have to feel calm to act calm, and That's what makes you untouchable. Third, use questions as weapons. When you're under attack, don't defend. Ask, why do you say that? What makes you think that's true? Can you explain what you mean? Questions shift the burden of proof. They expose assumptions. They slow the emotional momentum in negotiation. This is a known tactic. FBI hostage negotiators use calibrated questions not to gain control, but to reveal what the other person doesn't want to admit. Questions disarm the aggressive. They make manipulators stumble. They not confrontational. They're surgical. Fourth, deliver truth cleanly. Hard truths don't require drama. Only clarity. Say what needs to be said. Direct. Simple. No sugar, no softness. This doesn't mean you're cruel. It means you're honest, and honesty without apology is rare, which is why it's powerful. Say it once, then stop talking. People remember not the length of your message, but its sharpness. Fifth, don't seek agreement, seek alignment. Most people try to win conflict by being understood, but sometimes you won't be, and that's okay. Your job is not to convince everyone. Your job is to remain aligned with yourself. Even when others disapprove, agreement is a bonus. Alignment is the goal. When you stop needing everyone's validation, you stop negotiating with your own voice. Machiavelli once said, "It is better to be feared than loved." If you cannot be both, but fear here doesn't mean terror, it means respect. It means others know you have limits, that you won't be manipulated, that your silence is not weakness, but patience. And when you do speak, you mean it. People respect. What is rare? What is consistent? What is sovereign? Sovereignty isn't about dominating others. It's about not being dominated by their moods, their guilt, or their expectations. That's the essence of strategic conflict. Tactical courage doesn't look like victory in the moment. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like saying, "This isn't a conversation I'm willing to have." Sometimes it looks like being the only one in the room, not performing. But these are the moments that build inner gravity. You become someone people don't want to cross, not because you're threatening, but because you're anchored. You speak few words, but when you do, the room listens, because you've trained yourself not to speak from reactivity, but from resolve. In the end, conflict isn't about being combative. It's about being clear about your values, clear about your needs, clear about the cost of silence. The most dangerous people aren't those who fight to win arguments. They're the ones who fight only when it matters, who know how to sit in tension without losing themselves. Tactical courage is not the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it. You don't fight because you're angry. You fight because your silence is no longer self-respect. Closing message: freedom requires friction. Peace without power is not peace. It is submission. That's how Nietzsche saw the world, not as a playground, but as a proving ground, a place where comfort often disguises control, and where harmony is sometimes just fear in a mask. The desire to be liked, the need to be approved of, the instinct to avoid confrontation. These are not harmless social habits. They are chains, quiet, polite, and socially rewarded, but chains. Nonetheless, you were not born to be agreeable. You were not built to shrink in the name of civility. You were made to become, to carve out a life aligned with what you know to be true. And truth almost always begins with friction. What if you stopped avoiding hard conversations? What if you didn't flinch when someone disapproved of your choices? What if you were willing to lose comfort, connection, and even approval in exchange for self-respect? This is the fork in the road that everyone faces eventually, on one path. Peace through obedience, fewer arguments, more friends, but the quiet knowing that your real thoughts, your real feelings, and your real values were never fully spoken on. The other path: friction, misunderstandings, resistance, but also clarity, integrity, freedom, not the freedom others grant you, the freedom you grant yourself by refusing to perform. Nietzsche didn't preach chaos for its own sake. He wasn't glorifying conflict. He was reminding us, nothing real comes without cost. Growth is uncomfortable. Truth is disruptive. Freedom is earned. You will be labeled difficult, intense, too much. But beneath those labels is something rare, an individual who no longer dances for approval, This is the deeper kind of peace. Not the peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the peace that comes from surviving it, learning from it, letting it strip away the fake so the real can finally stand. Self-possession is the goal, not dominance, not rebellion. Just the quiet strength of knowing you no longer need to be liked to be whole. Oh, the final question is not, how can I avoid conflict? The real question is, what truth am I avoiding just to stay liked? Freedom requires friction, and once you stop fearing it, you'll discover the kind of peace that no one can take from you. If you found this exploration of Stoicism inspiring, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more philosophical insights, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you content that enriches your life. Thank you for watching.